let's take a look at cultural values. Again, it's important to remember that values impact behavior by interacting with our personality traits, our other values, and our goals. When our cultural values do not match the situational values, our motivation, communication, and performance can be negatively impacted, and we might be more prone to interpersonal conflicts within that environment. For this reason, IO psychologists attempt to measure the match between a culture's values and organizational practices. Projecting one culture's values onto another culture isn't sustainable. Although Hofstede is often associated with cultural values, Triandis was actually the first to identify a difference between individualistic and collectivistic values in the early 1970s. In the 1980s, Hofstede published his research of cultural values. He surveyed about 116,000 employees working for IBM in 50 countries. Today, his research has identified 6 cultural values, but we're only going to cover the 4 original values here. The first dimension is power distance. Cultures that are high in power distance accept power inequality. They tolerate it. They understand that there's a large power gap between low status members and high status members. Low power distance cultures are less tolerant of this large gap. The United States tends to be relatively low in power distance. The second dimension is uncertainty avoidance. Cultures that are low in uncertainty avoidance are comfortable with ambiguity. High uncertainty avoidant cultures are not comfortable with ambiguity. They take steps to reduce ambiguity. Planning, policies, procedures, all of the above help high uncertainty avoidant cultures control their environment, or at least gives them the perception of control. The United States has a moderate level of uncertainty avoidance, but leans toward the lower end of this dimension. The third dimension is individualism versus collectivism. Individualistic cultures value independence, the individual and their goals, and self-sufficiency. Collectivistic cultures value interdependence, group goals, and respect for tradition. The United States tends to score high in individualism. It's often rated as the most individualistic culture on the planet. The fourth dimension is masculinity versus femininity. Highly masculine cultures prefer achievement and assertiveness, qualities that United States citizens often associate with masculinity. Highly feminine cultures prefer relationships and cooperation. The United States tends to score high in masculinity. Anyone can access Hofstede's database via a quick Google search for the website. Here, you can see the United States profile. A culture can score anywhere from 0 to 100 on each of the 6 dimensions. You can also compare cultures. You can compare the United States values to those of any other country. One of the reasons why Hofstede's dimensions are so popular is that by measuring these values in individual people, psychologists have been able to identify differences between groups. For example, in individualistic cultures, people want to be rewarded for their individual contribution, for their individual performance. People from individualistic cultures also tend to be more motivated when working alone as opposed to working in a team. In collectivistic cultures, however, people want rewards that foster group harmony. And people tend to be more motivated when they are working with other people in groups, in teams. These differences then have implications for rewards and recognition programs and for designing the work. Should we use individuals or should we use teams? People in collectivistic cultures like working with their in-group members, with people they know and are familiar with. As a result, they tend to resist being asked to work with out-group members, more so than people from individualistic cultures. With that being said, people in collectivistic cultures tend to be more involved than people in individualistic cultures. Social loafing, for example, is less common in collectivistic cultures. Another important difference to consider is that in some cultures, people rely heavily on signals, on hidden meanings behind what they say. The United States is a low context culture. We tend to say what we mean and be more direct in our communication. In high context cultures, we struggle to communicate because we are not skilled in perceiving and responding to these signals. As I mentioned earlier, researchers have also found differences between high power distance cultures and low power distance cultures. In cultures where power inequality is tolerated, supervisors' motivational strategies will likely have a stronger effect. In other words, supervisors have more power to motivate in high power distance cultures. In low power distance cultures, people tend to be more resistant to the influence of a supervisor and authority figure. Also, when supervisors have some sort of a negative reaction, such as disappointment, these negative reactions produce a more negative reaction in the employees than they would in a low power distance culture. And finally, low status members in high power distance cultures tend to avoid challenging their superiors. Remember when we learned about managing up? These strategies are foreign to people in high power distance cultures. Some of them wouldn't dream of managing up, and therefore an organizational culture or a supervisor that encourages their employees to manage up may not have the intended effect on people from high power distance cultures. In the next part of this lecture, we will look at job characteristics.